Okay, we're back again, and we're concluding this chapter 10 of Genesis, which is titled in most of our Bibles, The Table of Nations. A quick reminder that you can access the transcript of all these talks available in the episodes notes section of any audio version of the podcast you might be looking at. But as we launch off today, we're going to close out chapter 10, and I'd like to do that by making a couple of final observations. In listing all these nations, 2 family lines have been seen to be identified, and the 2 people at the head of those families identified that have been focused on are Nimrod and Eber, and that's a very critical aspect of this chapter. Now let me just reconfirm for you before concluding that this text has nothing to do with race. This text is about nations. There are 2 sons who are seen to produce a particular nation described here, but those nations would already be seen to be ethnically mixed. Those nations would have in some way multi-ethnic, just like many nations are today. So the question is, why does Genesis 10 tell us about the nations on earth? God is seen in this chapter to be working through nations to accomplish his will. The line of Jephthah is traced for just 2 generations early on and then dismissed. Ham's descendants, well, they're described to the 3rd generation, but the 3rd generation only. Shem is followed for 5 generations in the passage, but then that family tree will be continued for us somewhere else in the Bible. So the structure and the content of the chapter is giving us a clue as to where we're going here. What is going to become very clear as we work our way through the remainder of the book of Genesis is that among these nations, God will be seen to choose a single nation, and that single nation will come out from the line of Eber, out of which that line he will bring a redeemer for the whole world. You see, God in this chapter is preparing so that later, through the Hebrew race, referred to later as the Jewish nation, a redeemer for the whole world will appear. This chapter was designed to help us see the world from God's point of view. Early on, Nimrod was highlighted as an example of rebellion, but Eber is highlighted and emphasized as the line by which a redeemer will reconcile humanity with God once again. When we come to Genesis chapter 10, we can just arrive at it and see a long list of names, and we can maybe yawn and get a little out of it and move quickly as on and try and find something more interesting in our Bibles. But let me ask you a question. When you look at the world, what do you see? When you look at the world, do you just look around and see people whose identity lies in their race or in their ethnic group or their identity group? Well, I think this chapter tells us don't fall into the trap. Don't fall into that trap, because if you examine the details carefully, what you will see is God at work. You will see God not only at work then, but God at work today. And God is at work in the midst of a rebellious people. He still wants to accomplish his will and ultimately to bring forward a redeemer for the whole earth. When you sit down and you watch the news of an evening, or when you read your newspaper, or maybe today when you get your news on your computer or your smartphone, what do you see? Well, I would suggest what most of us see is a mess. We see all kinds of things. We can see rebellion, but we can see what God wants us to see if we choose to be open to him. And God really wants us to see the world the way he sees it. Now, perhaps you sometimes look at the world and say, why doesn't just God come and wipe away all of this mess? Do you sometimes think about how wicked the world is and say, why doesn't God just come down and give the earth a clean slate, start again? Well, God already did that. We heard about it. It was the flood. But he has a new plan for us, a better plan, and that is being revealed here, friends. A plan through which God will save people. So when you're looking at the stuff that's going on in the world, instead of getting angry and frustrated, we ought to be praying for people. In the midst of the rebellion, when we see people, from our perspective, shaking their fist at God, Please just pray, Lord, reveal yourself to all these lost people. Please, Lord, save them like you did before. So here's the question again. When you look at the world, what do you see? Do you just see the world geographically? Do you just see it culturally? Or do you divide it by language and ethnicity? But friends, try and look at the world from God's point of view. God wants to redeem rebellious people. That's what we ought to see. Do you see it culturally, materially, or financially? Do you see the world culturally? Do you see it materially? Do you see it economically and financially? Or do you see it spiritually? How do you see the world today? You know, when we were younger, my wife and I had the privilege of traveling a great deal. We went all over Europe, but we also went further afield and visited places like Kenya, Pakistan, Nepal, and Tunisia. You know, I've been up the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and I've been down in the deepest cave in Wales. And I've walked as a tourist, and I've visited many places over the years. But you know what is it's easy to look at the world and just see all the surface stuff. But it's perhaps harder and takes a little more effort to walk the world and see the spiritual stuff, to try and see things as God sees them. He wants us to see the people as he sees them. He wants us to see people who are lost or who are in rebellion against him, but people who need to be redeemed. Just the same as it was all these thousands of years ago when this passage was first written. So here's my question and a thought I want to leave with as we close out chapter 10. When you walk through life, do you see yourself as a tourist or a missionary? So remember, friends, we need to see the world and walk the world as a missionary, as God's missionary, and not just tourists passing through. Look forward to coming back together with you again soon.